Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. On Wednesday, at a coffee shop outside, just across the street from the Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv, two middle-aged men sat down for some coffee. One of them was wearing a black t-shirt, pair of jeans. The other was wearing a suit with a tie. One was Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, and the other, the man with the suit, was Avigdor Lieberman, former defense minister, former finance minister, former foreign minister, and head of the Israel Beitenu party, still a member of the Knesset in the opposition. Why did they meet? We'll hear soon, but likely to try to show Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, here they are, plotting out in the open to bring about his downfall. There's a lot that's happened in Israel, politically speaking, definitely, since October 7th. And while initially in the aftermath of the greatest massacre of Jews on a single day since the Holocaust, there was a thought originally that Netanyahu's days were numbered, that it would be almost impossible for him to survive long in his role. But here we are, nearly 10 months later, and here he is, still in his job, and just in a couple of days, taking off on the inaugural flight of Israel's new Air Force One style plane to Washington, where he will meet with President Joe Biden and deliver a speech before a joint session of Congress. Netanyahu not only is not gone, but it seems with every day that passes that it will be harder for his political rivals to remove him. How has this happened? And what should we expect in the months to come when it comes to Israeli politics? Joining me today are two people. The first is Tal Shalev, a veteran journalist, currently serving as the political analyst for Walla News. Tal has long been covering the corridors of power in the Knesset as well as in the Prime Minister's office, and we hear her insights of what's happening and what has happened in the Israeli political system. Then I'm joined by senior JPPI fellow Shmuel Rosner, who will bring us the latest poll results from JPPI's poll, looking at Israel's level of trust and Israelis' level of trust in their politicians and in their government institutions. Here we go. Tal Shalev, it's great to have you with us at JPPI. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Israeli politics. And I was thinking before this, like, where do we even begin? So I'm going to start with what's coming up next week, and then we can go also a little back in time. But Netanyahu is supposed to finally get on the Wings of Zion airplane, Kanaf Tzion, what is called the inaugural trip that we've all been waiting for, of the Israeli Air Force One to fly to Washington. Going to give this speech before Congress, meet with President Biden, assuming Biden is over COVID by that stage. And the trip, while obviously of importance for Israel, always for an Israeli prime minister to meet the president, always to speak before Congress, these are always important things. But really, it seems to me this trip is much more of political significance than it is of really substance. We Israelis don't need to hear a speech before Congress. We need to see the hostages come back. So walk me through, from your perspective, what is he really doing here? Why does he need this trip? And then we could start to talk maybe a bit more about what is even happening politically in Israel at the moment.
Well, if I put aside Netanyahu's natural tendency to play with American politics a few months before the election, and just focus on what he is trying to achieve internally, then I see this trip as an attempt by Netanyahu to kind of regain his status as a statesman, as Mr. America, as the protector of Israel. We'll be almost 10 months after, the 7th of October and the worst disaster ever. Netanyahu has not been abroad in this time. And before that, I don't remember such a long time, 10 months with him, without him being abroad and going overseas. And I think it's not so much for all of Israelis, because as we know, about 60 to 70% of Israelis have no trust in Netanyahu at the moment. But it's a trip and a speech, which the whole trip was designed around the speech, is mainly intended for his own electoral base, to recuperate and to try and own his status once again as a man of the big world, as the only one who can represent Israeli interests right now. Now, for Netanyahu's electoral base, just to see him speaking in English, and we know this from 2015, just to see him speaking in English and get standing ovations, which he will get in any case, even if the cameras don't focus on the people leaving the walkout by the Democrats, there will be standing ovations, there will be a speech, and that serves a very important political goal from Netanyahu's point of view, and that is kind of to consolidate his electoral base. Another thing is that this trip is going to take over the country's agenda. Since from the minute Knaf Tzion will leave Ben Gurion Airport, and even before now, people are only talking about Knaf Tzion, and then people will only be talking about his meeting with the president, and then people will only be talking about the speech, and it'll be a whole week, which is all about Netanyahu, which here in Israel, he finds it much more difficult to do right now. So I think that I, again, do not really understand what the diplomatic goal of this trip is. But I definitely understand the internal political goal, which is to consolidate the base and to control the agenda.
By the way, diplomatically speaking or politically speaking, foreign policy, you're walking into a Washington that's very complex at the moment, right? They're just a couple months away from their own presidential election. Biden is on the ropes, more and more calls every single day for him not to run. Trump after the assassination attempt, like you speak before Congress, you're too nice to Biden, you upset Trump. You say something to Trump, you upset the Democrats. You're going to have protesters, like, but whatever. Obviously, as you very well articulated, there's a lot of political significance, but I want us to zoom back for a moment in time, because you and I didn't speak right after October 7th, but a lot of people were saying at the time, and political analysts like yourself, that there's no way Bibi survives this. There's no way that he makes it this far. And here we are, as you pointed out, 10 months later. Not only is he pretty stable in the polls, around 20 or so seats, he's up from where his lowest point was. But I mean, look, he's like, the prospect of his government falling is not really there at the moment. How do you explain that? I mean, so, how is he able to pull this off?
So the answer, I think, divides into two. It divides into Netanyahu himself, who is a political genius. And in the course of the past 10 months, he succeeded to reshape the narrative, to undermine the narrative that he is the one to blame for October 7th, put a lot of the blame, rightly so, on the army and the security apparatus, and not on himself. And slowly, and you see this slowly, put in messages to the public, which actually worked. He's turned the story of the 7th of October to a story about the Palestinian Authority or having a Palestinian state. He has been telling the Israeli public that a total victory is just moments away. And if you speak to, just the Vox Populaire and the people in the streets today, that's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the big disaster and catastrophe of the 7th of October. And Netanyahu, one thing he does really well is, stall and take his time. And all Netanyahu wanted was to buy time, because the further you go away from October 7th, people forget. That's just natural, or at least the trauma is less vivid. But the other part of the answer is, of course, Netanyahu's comrades or the people surrounding Netanyahu. So first of all, Benny Gantz joining Netanyahu in the first month, even though at the time it totally appeared as the right thing to do, and it was very much supported and it was consensus move, he gave Netanyahu legitimacy at his lowest point.
Right.
And not only did he give him legitimacy, but he stalled his legitimacy for a long time. So he should have left perhaps January, February. That's when we started to understand that Netanyahu is treating Gantz really bad, like he did in the past, but he stayed there for another 4 or 5 months, in which all Netanyahu did was campaign while having Gantz by his side legitimize him. The other thing is the people surrounding Netanyahu in the Likud. In the first month, you could hear voices in the Likud, significant voices, saying that exactly what you said, that Netanyahu is over, that it's time to replace him. But Netanyahu very successfully brought his party together and killed any attempt of revolt. And basically, we only have one person in the Likud actually coming out against him, and that is Gallant, his his defense minister. And last is the opposition. The same reason that the former government, Bennett-Lapid government, collapsed is the same reason that Netanyahu is still in power. They are a divided opposition, if it's between Jews and Arabs, or if it's between left and right, or if it's between Gantz and Lapid. And with so many divides, they cannot really pose a threat or actually pressure Netanyahu. And they are also, they're just not united enough, and they're not vicious enough, if that's a bad thing that we can say. But if Netanyahu was the leader of the opposition.
Oh, no, for sure. I can only imagine. I mean,
exactly.
It's like you're saying, Tal, that Benny Gantz's biggest problem is that he's a mensch. That's his weakness to some extent.
I think that at this point, Benny Gantz's biggest problem is that he wants everyone to like him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for many, many months, and he's continuing now, he's kind of in the middle, walking in the middle, trying to keep everyone on his side. But we're in a situation in Israel internally, socially, politically, where the middle is actually helping Netanyahu. If you don't take a clear stand against Netanyahu, you're actually assisting him. I don't think Benny Gantz intentionally helped Netanyahu, but the result is that he helped Netanyahu rise from his worst point and continue, and he gave him time to to get his act together and continue to control his coalition very, very closely. And last but not least is that at every point that Netanyahu had to choose between Gantz or the good of the country and his coalition, he always abided by one principle, and that is that his coalition, the 64 seats, is above all. And if you do that, then your coalition is probably going to survive.
So let me ask you, I mean, there are two big tests that Netanyahu has to deal with at the moment. One of them is on Sunday, the defense ministry, the IDF, will be issuing about 1,000 call-up draft orders. What's the first stage, what's known as a Tzav Rishon, to about 1,000 Haredim, maybe a little more, a little less. Will they show up? Will they not? Let's see. I'm doubtful that this is going to immediately lead to more ultra-Orthodox in the army. So far, you're hearing mixed voices. Doesn't seem like they're going to bolt the government, Shas, United Torah Judaism, as a result. That's challenge one. I want to hear your thoughts on whether the draft bill is going to bring down this government. Challenge two, more immediate maybe, more urgent definitely from my perspective, is the potential hostage deal. We know that there are negotiations that continue. Shas has told the prime minister, make the deal. Ministers within the Likud party, Gila Gamliel, Miri Regev, others have said to the prime minister, make the deal. But he's nervous because he's got Ben Gvir and Smotrich who have said, we'll bring down your government. We got people's lives on the line. So where does Netanyahu go with these two issues that they're here? They're real at the moment, and they're real threats for his continued coalition survival.
So I think the most important thing here is the calendar. As when Netanyahu leaves to DC, then basically the Knesset has another week in session, and then it goes out to a long, over 90 days of recess. That means that even if there is a threat from the conscription issue and the draft issue with the ultra-Orthodox, it won't come into effect until after the recess. So even if we're hearing voices now from the ultra-Orthodox parties who are very angry at the army, we're not hearing the word Netanyahu or the government from the rabbis or the Haredi politicians yet. They're all of it. It's all about the Supreme Court and the army.
Right.
Meaning they're not at the point that they want to bring down the government yet. But the Supreme Court ruling has a lot of implications on budgets, on special budgets and allowances that the ultra-Orthodox parties get that they're supposed to be regulated by the draft bill, which doesn't exist. And as these allowances and stipends are starting to be stopped and halted, that could create another wave of pressure. I mean, when the ultra-Orthodox parties realize that there's no way for them to get the money back retroactively, then that, I think, will be the point where they're start to really threat the government. Now, the recess is also important for the other issue of the hostage deal. So it's true, we have Ben Gvir and Smotrich where there's constant threat to leave the government. And so far, Netanyahu has been very attentive to that threat in the way he's been handling the negotiations. But we are reaching the summer recess, which means that even if Netanyahu makes a deal somewhere in the upcoming weeks, let's pray, then
they can't really bring down the government as well.
Exactly. They can't really bring down the government, and he can tell them, let's go through the first stage. Let's bring back the hostages. And when the first stage, the ones that are alive, and when the first stage is over, let's see. So I think Netanyahu again will try and stall time and buy more time with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, even if he makes the deal. That being said, I don't think at this point he is ready to make a deal. He's still talking about the Hamas needing to give up more and that he needs more concessions from Hamas. That might change during his trip to DC. But at the moment, it doesn't seem, it's true, they say he wants a deal, but then comes a but. But we want Hamas to give up some of the demands. So I'm not sure Netanyahu is at that point where he's ready to anger Ben Gvir and Smotrich so much, even if you have the recess.
You know, about a week ago, 10 days ago, I was of the opinion that he's going to try to make a deal before he goes to Washington, show up at Congress. I'm the guy who brought back the hostages, you know, like the 4 languages of redemption from Passover. Hitzalti, Ga'alti, Hotzeti, right? I brought, I redeemed, I liberated, whatever. And then I was actually speaking with the top official in the defense ministry who said to me, no, you got it totally wrong. He wants to go, and he wants to go as Churchill. He wants to go as Zelensky, the guy at war. He wants the war to continue. Where were you on that kind of thought?
So I actually had a very similar experience last week on Thursday after interviewing one of the mothers of the hostages, Daniela Gilboa's mother, and she was optimistic and full of hope. And I said, well, maybe I'll try to adopt that. And I started to build this theory that maybe this is the time, and maybe now Netanyahu actually wants a deal. And I even shared it with some people, and everyone told me, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. He just wants us to talk about the deal. He doesn't want there to be an actual deal. And then about 3 hours later, after I had this very optimistic thought, he gave a speech at an IDF base in which he once again raised his demands and toughened his stance towards the negotiation. And I kind of felt too naive for even contemplating the fact that he might want a deal.
Right.
One thing
just when we want to think, we want to give
Netanyahu,
him the benefit. Yeah, just when you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you know, he's finally doing the right thing for the country, and then that shatters for everyone. Yeah,
I think we're all, you know, in the past since this government was established, we all are waiting for that moment to see where Netanyahu wakes up. If it's about the judicial overhaul that ruined the country economically and socially and even security-wise, or after the war, we keep on waiting for the old Netanyahu to appear. But I'm not sure the old Netanyahu even exists anymore. I mean, the old Netanyahu is the one up until 2015, or even 2018, if we want to be very generous. But the new Netanyahu, or the revitalized Netanyahu, does not act in the statesman way we would expect from the old Netanyahu. And I think that's one of the biggest disappointments, that the old Netanyahu did so many good things for this country. You can like him, you can hate him, but he had a very impressive record for this country. But since this government was establishment, at every point that he can choose the good of the country over his own political interests, he's just not choosing it.
Sadly, I hate to say, but there were people, and myself among them, who from the beginning of his indictment, when he was indicted, predicted that this clash of interests will always happen, and unfortunately we just keep seeing this play out time after time, where he prioritizes himself above the national security interest. I'm sure, by the way, in his mind, if we asked him, if he was here, he would say, no, God forbid. In his mind, prioritizing himself is prioritizing the country, right? Because he believes that he has to be in power for us to remain alive and safe. Tal, this week there was so there's a lot of talk, obviously, of if there is going to be an election, when there's going to be an election. We don't know, but at the earliest, based on what you're saying, is even if the government were to fall in the last week of October, beginning of November, we're talking about March, February, April 2025. So we got some time. But the people who are kind of warming up on the sidelines, one of them we saw having an interesting cup of coffee this week with Avigdor Lieberman at a Tel Aviv cafe, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister. Now, it was interesting. Walk us through, what are they doing? First of all, I'll tell you what caught my eye. I mean, a few things. I think anyone who's been to Serona knows Biga, knows the coffee shop.
I think we even met there once.
We probably had coffee there before. I had a couple friends who sent me photos from there, because a lot of high-tech people sit there during the day. Bennett's there with his black t-shirt and his jeans, and Lieberman, in the heat of the summer, right? It's so hot outside, is sitting there with a suit and a tie. Classic, Yvette Lieberman. But why are they doing this out in the open? What are they trying to achieve?
So first of all, I think they're trying to annoy Netanyahu. The only real threat for Netanyahu in the next election is a unification of if they join forces, basically, and build another new right-wing party. So just having the photo gives all of us something to talk about, and this reaches, of course, Netanyahu as well. B, Bennett is out of the picture, and he's looking for ways to be part of the discourse. And most of his posts on Twitter and Facebook are not interesting enough to make him part of the discussion. But yesterday, everyone talked about it for the whole day. C, in the past week or so, Netanyahu's what we call מכונת התעמולה, מכונת הרעל.
The propaganda machine.
Exactly. Netanyahu's propaganda machine has been spreading a video of Naftali Bennett, I think it's from 2019, an interview he gave in 2019, in which basically he says that Lieberman is the founder of the whole method of the Qatari money transfer.
The cash, the suitcases, right.
Exactly. And I think that the meeting, in one aspect of it, was to try and, put that out and tell Netanyahu's propaganda machine, you're trying to divide us, but that won't help. We're still sitting together, and it's fine. And last but not least, earlier this week on Saturday, Dana Weiss reported on Channel 2 that Yossi Cohen, the former Mossad chief, who was presumably supposed to be, a key player in this new right-wing party, has decided not to enter politics at the moment. In brackets, I'll say that in the background of this is the National Inquiry Committee on the submarines affair that sent both Netanyahu and Yossi Cohen and a lot of other people very grave warning letters last month, basically warning them that they might be found guilty. And Yossi Cohen has a very harsh letter there. So that's one of the reasons that he decided not to run at this point. But I think one of the reasons for them to display that they're meeting is to show we don't need Yossi Cohen, we can unite and we can meet together. And after I said all of that, I'm going to very, very cautiously say that I'm not sure that at the end of the day, Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman will actually join forces.
Well, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that I potentially see is who's number one.
So that's the first question. Who's number one? Bennett, of course, thinks he needs to be number one. Lieberman, in the meanwhile, is getting much stronger. He's more than doubled his strength since the war began. He's currently polling for 14, 15 seats, and each of them will want to be number one. But another thing, it's not clear that they actually have the same electoral, that they have the same electoral, areas. Lieberman is very strong on the right. Naftali Bennett is much stronger in the center amongst Lapid and Gantz voters, but in the right, he has a very bad reputation. He is considered a liar, a betrayer, because of the Bennett-Lapid government.
Right.
And I'm not sure that, 1 and 1 will be 3 here. Perhaps 1 and 1 here will be 1.5.
Well, I mean, you kind of saw that, by the way, with the Channel 13 poll. I think it was last week, which polled, the existing parties and found that, Benny Gantz still is about 25, Lapid and Lieberman and together, see, they get to about 50, let's say. And then you take the Bennett, and then they brought in the Bennett-Lieberman merger, which found that gets 30 seats, let's say 31, 32. But then if you take their 32, which is much bigger, you take their 32 and you add to it Lapid and Benny Gantz, you still get to about 50. So in other words, they're setting up the chairs just a little differently on their side of the room, which leads me to the question of, can anyone move people from right to the center? Or is that just not possible? Or is there someone that you see who can actually do that? Because that's the way to potentially win, no?
So I think the challenge is not to move people from the right to the center, but to leave people in the right, but just move them away from Netanyahu. Meaning that's why I think Lieberman at this point would be better off without Bennett if he just brings some more attractive right-wing names to his list.
And he pulls votes from Likud, is what you're saying.
He pulls votes from Likud, and we can just imagine if we have like a gallery, if he's surrounded by a gallery of, I don't know, I'm just floating names out loud, Yoram Cohen, ex-Shabak chief, Moshe Kachlon, and perhaps Gidon Sa'ar and Zev Elkin, who will not have a place to run or cannot run independently. I think that is the only way to take votes away from the right. Another thing that's very important for the next election, and it's something we can't really test, but Netanyahu won the last election because he had very high voter turnout in the Likud cities in the periphery, in the north and the south. If you compare the 2022 elections to the 2021 elections, the difference is the voter turnout in the south and the north. I don't know, after the 7th of October and 10 months later of war, in which both the south and the north are still evacuated, I'm not sure the voter turnout in the periphery will be the same for Netanyahu. And I think that is one of the most important factors for the next election, because it's not as if they'll go and vote for someone else, they just won't vote for him.
Right. So I want to let you go, Tal, but just one last question. One of the things that depresses me a bit, I mean, there's a lot, but one of the things that depresses me is I kind of look at the gallery of people, of who's out there. And it's like, it's the same people over again. Like I'm supposed to get excited by Naftali Bennett returning to politics. Like that's the excitement, right? No, I'm sorry. You were there. You became prime minister. Like, where are all the new people? Where are these amazing Israeli young entrepreneurs? By the way, someone gave me a great line. I think it was, wars mint heroes, but they also mint leaders. Like, where are the people who are coming off the battlefield, out of Miluim, out of the reserves, founding a party and run? Like, why are we not seeing more of that at the moment? And maybe we won't, or do you predict that we will?
I think that's a really good question. I don't really know what my intuitive answer is that it's the system, that the Israeli political system is very difficult to start a new party if you don't have deep pockets. And it's much easier to try and enter one of the existing parties. And all of the existing parties are controlled by the same old men, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing which I find astounding is that, we're after the biggest security collapse of the IDF ever, and still a security background is the most important thing today for being a politician. So I think there's something about Israeli politics that's, very, very stiff, and it's kept stiff, and people are deterred from entering politics. That being said, I don't know, when elections will be. You mentioned this earlier. There are a lot of things that we thought after the 7th of October would change altogether. And at the end of the day, we're finding out everything is very much the same. But at the moment, Israelis are in despair. They're depressed, they're in despair. And that's a very bad sentiment to motivate any political participation. And only if you give people some ray of hope, then perhaps there'll be kind of a change of generations inside the political system. But hey, in the US
Exactly. I was just thinking, they're if anything, they're worse than we are. So
exactly.
Okay, Tal Shalev, the political analyst for Walla News. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Yaakov.
Shmuel, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining us. And
thank you for having me.
Of course. You just this week published the latest findings in JPPI's Kol Ha'am survey, a survey that we do monthly to get basically the pulse of what's happening in Israeli society. And there were a couple of findings that I found particularly interesting. One of them being continued decline in trust in obviously all government institutions, but particularly the IDF. So talk to us a bit about that. And then, of course, some stuff and some findings that relate to what's happening, the big news of the week, which is obviously Trump, Biden, and everything going on in the United States. So let's start with, what do we see about the Israeli mindset here in Israel?
Well, we should start by stating that the trust of the public in the political institutions is quite low since the beginning of the war. It declined further with the breakup of the emergency government that included the Machaneh Mamachti camp. So what we see now is trust that hovers around the 30%, both in the government and in the Prime Minister Netanyahu. We should say that trust in the Prime Minister was low even before the war because of the judicial reform and all the social upheaval that we had last year in Israel. So Netanyahu entered this war with low approval rating. The war did not improve his approval rating, and it is still low. So Israel is led by politicians in which we don't have much trust. That's one part of the equation. What we discovered this month is that we have a similar problem with the higher echelon of the IDF commanders. Up until last month, we asked a general question about trust in IDF commanders. And trust in IDF commanders is a question that you can interpret in many ways. Am I asking about the platoon commander? Am I asking about the brigade commander? Am I asking about the chief of staff? These aren't the same people. It's not the same rank. This month, we decided to be more specific in the way we phrased the question, and we asked specifically about the high command. And when we asked about the high command, we discovered something that is quite disturbing. Most of the public does not have much trust in the high command of the IDF, namely the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, maybe chief of intelligence, maybe the the Southern Command commander, maybe the Northern Command commander. We didn't ask about specific names, but we know that when people refer to the high command, they refer to the upper rank of the IDF, commanding forces, which means that on the strategic level, people do not have trust in these commanders. They might trust the commander who leads the troop or the brigade in the field. They must think that the field commanders of their children, our children, are fantastic. But when we go up and look at the strategic level, the trust is quite low, which means that this war is guided, is governed, is led by both military command and political leadership, in which we do not have trust. Replacing the military command is the job of the political class, but we don't trust the politicians. So we don't want them to be in charge of replacing the commanders. In some way, this will have to be resolved. I would assume that election would be the right way to do such thing, to let the people choose a new leadership, and then the new leadership to choose new leadership for the military. But right now, we don't have any plans for new election, so we are stuck. We are stuck with a prime minister that we don't trust, a government that we don't trust, and the higher command that we also do not trust.
In God we trust. I mean, who are we supposed to trust in that sense? It's quite depressing. What you're telling me when it talks about the trust in the top command. I for over 10 years was the military reporter, and I got this feeling early on in covering the IDF so closely that the last job, I'm curious what you think, Shmuel, the last job that is authentic and real, based on merit and based on talent and qualifications, is what you would call a magad, a battalion commander. And from being because a battalion commander, you were a good soldier in Golani, you became a mem, like a team leader, you became a company commander, you became a MP, a company commander, then you become, if you do the track and you're good, you do the right job and you're good and you lead and you know what you're doing, you could become a battalion commander. From there, it becomes very political. Still talented. You have to have talent. But it's also, you have to tie yourself to the right horse. You have to have the right political connections. And you got to play politics in the role.
Well, if you'll do a survey of platoon commanders, they'll probably have a different opinion on this matter. Some of them will say that the politics begins when you become an officer, or even among those who want to go to officers' school. There's always,
Sure.
in every human affair, there is some politics involved. But I agree, the field commanders are people that are tested mostly by their soldiers. They see them in action. They know what's their worth. They know if they are brave or not as brave. They know if they have charisma or not. When you go up on this ladder of advancement, you begin to report to your superiors more than your soldiers. And then it becomes more a game of politics than a game of actual ability in commanding the troops. Then again, when you think about trusting the high command, it's not, we shouldn't be surprised by such finding. The IDF failed miserably on October 7th, and people look mostly to the leaders that were in charge at that time, and all of them are still
They're still in their jobs. All
of them still hold their jobs. So, do we trust the chief of staff of the IDF? He's a great leader. He's a great commander. He's a brave person. And I'm sure he didn't mean any harm when he was there in charge on October 7th. But, he got the bad luck, or maybe made the wrong decisions, and he was in charge. And in some way, he should well, he took responsibility for it, but responsibility comes with action. And at some point, it's clear that all of these commanders will have to be replaced. Again, the only reason this cannot happen now is because of the lack of trust in the people who need to choose the next generation of commanders.
Right.
That's the political leaders.
Right, which is why people are saying to Herzl Levy, head of the army, and
Yeah,
Ronen Bar,
yeah,
head of the Shabak, stay
yeah,
until there's a new political leadership.
because they don't trust Netanyahu and they don't want Netanyahu and the current government to be the one in charge of appointing the successor of Herzl Levy.
But it is quite, I mean, it is quite sad. I mean, always you're going to have low levels of trust. And we've seen over the years, low levels of trust in the Knesset, low levels of trust in the police. But when you have across the board such a low degree of public trust in the institutions that are meant to keep us alive, meant to keep us thriving and growing as a country, it's not that it's a very pessimistic outlook, I would say, looking forward.
Yes, I agree. It is quite sad. You know, two or 3 months ago back in May, we discovered in our JPPI polls for the first time that there is a complete shift in the way Israelis look at our chances of winning the war. Up until May, from November until April, most Israelis thought that Israel is likely to win the war. Starting in May, we see more Israelis who think that Israel might not win the war. And when you see that people aren't optimistic about winning the war, then, you know, why would they trust the leadership? Why would they trust the prime minister, the government, or the IDF command, who led us through 8 months or 9 months of fight, and we still don't see the light at the end of the tunnel? We still aren't sure that we can win the war. In such situation, the fact that people don't have much trust in our leadership is sad, as you said, but it's not quite a surprise.
Yeah. So talk me through the other findings that we found in this poll that have to do with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And let's just say we're talking today on Thursday ends the Republican National Convention, really quite the celebration of Donald Trump, who miraculously survived the assassination attempt on his life. I said miraculously because I'm sure, as you saw, Shmuel, that shooter like trajectory analysis of how his face was turned one way and how, you know, he always does that thing with the side, and because he turned, it only grazed his bullet. I mean, really looked, if it's real, looked to be pretty remarkable. But he comes on the heels of that, obviously up in the polls, choosing J.D. Vance. Lots to talk about him. We'll do that another time. But where do Israelis stand on who do they prefer to see win this election?
Okay, so say as background that in the last 2.5 decades, since the year 2000 or so, Israelis, generally speaking, prefer GOP presidents over Democratic presidents, or nominees, or, you know, candidates to be presidents. So they thought that George W. Bush is preferable to Al Gore, and when Bush became so vehemently supportive of Israel during the days of the Intifada, he deepened the feeling of Israelis that Republicans are better for Israel, more supportive of Israel than their Democratic counterparts. So in 2004, they preferred Bush over Kerry. 2008, McCain over Obama. 2012, Romney over Obama. 2016 was an interesting case because Donald Trump was a newcomer. Israelis didn't know him quite well. And with Hillary Clinton, many of them had mixed feelings, but ultimately it wasn't as clear as the Obama versus McCain or Obama versus Romney rounds, but still Israelis somewhat preferred Donald Trump. In 2020, it was very clear after 4 years of Trump, after he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, promoted the Abraham Accords, etc., Israelis thought that Trump would be the ultimate candidate for Israel, so they supported him. But then after October 7, we saw, for a short time, we saw a shift, which was interesting. In October, November, maybe December, when we asked Israelis about their preference, they gave Joe Biden higher marks. They gave Donald Trump lower marks. Why is that? Because of the warmth and the support and the backing of the Biden administration at the beginning of the war, right after October 7th, and in the initial weeks and months of the war, they felt that the support of Joe Biden was overwhelming, and they appreciated his support. And with Trump, it was complicated because he made some statements at the beginning of the war that were, confusing. Let's say that they were confusing. Right. He said some nasty things about the prime minister. He said some things, he praised Hamas and Hezbollah for their cunning and their
success in surprising Israel. Yeah.
And their success. So people didn't feel quite comfortable about what Trump said. They were, they welcomed the support of Biden. And for 2 or 3 months, we saw Israelis preferring Joe Biden over Donald Trump. That is over now. In recent months, we started asking the question, well, first we started asking about Biden. Does he still support Israel the way he did at the beginning of the war? And we saw a rising number of Israelis saying no. He supported Israel at the beginning of the war, but not anymore, or not to the same extent. And the more his ratings, so to speak, declined, the more his credentials declined with Israelis, the more they forgot about those confusing statements by Donald Trump. And this month, after the debate, after recent statements made both by the administration and Trump and his incoming VP, after all of these words, statements, and actions, we went back to, you can say we went back to normalcy. Israelis again believe that the Republican candidate is going to be better for Israel. They do understand, many of them do understand that Trump is a mixed baggage. They understand that in some way he's an isolationist. They understand that in some ways he will not be involved in Middle East affairs as much as Israel wants the United States to get involved. But by and large, they trust his instinct for supporting Israel more than they trust, not necessarily Biden himself, but Biden and his circle of Democratic advisors and his party and the activists of the Democratic Party. This whole atmosphere of having a Democratic administration seems more threatening to Israelis. So again, back to normalcy. If you ask Israelis, or if Israelis were to vote in the American election, Trump would be the next US president.
So if Israel was a swing state, Trump would carry our electoral votes.
Aren't we a swing state? Oh. I thought we are.
We'd like to think that we are. I'm not sure that we are. But Shmuel, that was very enlightening. Thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for being with us. As always, you can catch us on Mondays and Thursdays on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and as well as on the Times of Israel's website. In the meantime, have a great weekend and a Shabbat Shalom.